One of the cool things about being back for We Are Weekend is interacting with folks from different classes, from different walks of life, from different generations. And it's just awesome to hear their stories as far as their experiences when they were here on campus. I had a chance to actually go and tour Beaver Stadium. I had a chance to go to WPSU and see how they go about their daily activities to get folks involved in their operations.
Penn State is really a pivotal place for both my wife and I. We met here. I feel like I grew up at Penn State. It just broadened my horizons, both academically and also as a person. And being involved with different activities on campus really molded me into the person that I am today. We have 5 kids. So for us, trying to get away and do something just the 2 of us is really tough. So it's really great that we can have our kids with us and participate. They've had a great time participating in the different tours and activities, enjoying some of the food, and having them here as part of our family has really been able to allow us to enjoy the weekend, not just my wife and I, but our entire family together.
Being a pioneer is really special because it was like getting an award, and the award was just for being 50 years a graduate. But actually tonight I get to put the medals on some of the new pioneers, and it's passing the torch. And that's very special. And We Are Weekend allows me to do that for them, and hopefully they'll get enough out of We Are Weekend that they'll come back and do the same thing in the future years.
We thought it'd be really cool to bring alumni tour guides back to give tours with current students and really get that alumni and also current student perspective to be able to share all of our stories. And for us on the tours, it's been really fun because we're also hearing stories from other Penn State alumni. Even if they weren't tour guides, they have their own sort of understanding of campus and little stories from different areas. So for me, it's been just so great, that synergy of sort of stories and everyone sort of having their love for Penn State and being able to share that. For me, coming back to Penn State is so much about reliving old traditions, but also creating new ones. And I really thought coming back for We Are Weekend would be a great opportunity to start a new tradition at Penn State.
We are!
Hello and welcome to Chocolate 101, the history, science, and art of chocolate. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Martha Few, professor of history and women's gender and sexuality studies here at Penn State. And I'm joined here along with my colleagues, Drs. Amara Solari, Ciela Maximova, Helene Hopfer, and Mark Giltonen. And I want to say that we're delighted that we're together for what we hope will be both a fun and eye-opening discussion about the history, science, and culture of chocolate, as well as some chocolate tasting. Before we get started, we wanted to let you know that this workshop today is based on a new undergraduate class called Chocolate Worlds. This is designed and co-taught by me, Drs. Maximova in plant science, and Dr. Solari in anthropology and art history. This is part of a new type of course offered to Penn State undergraduates called an interdomain course, where in the course of one semester, students are exposed to different disciplinary perspectives on the topic of chocolate. And so we kind of got together and had the all work on chocolate. We got together and had this idea for this class, and this is part of what's come out of that. The goal is to introduce liberal arts majors to science research methods, as well as to introduce science majors and other majors to research methods of the liberal arts. Over the course of the semester, we invited other research specialists on cacao and chocolate here at Penn State, and we've asked 2 of them to join us here today. These include our colleague, Dr. Hopfer in food science and Dr. Giltonen in plant science. And now let me share a little bit of information about how the workshop will work today. We'll have about 10 minutes of content discussion based on information about a couple key aspects of the history, science, art, and anthropology of chocolate. And these will be interspersed with short 5 to 10 minute sessions where we'll discuss how to taste chocolate and actually taste the samples that you've purchased. So if you haven't already, you'll want to have your chocolate samples nearby. We're also going to encourage you, as you taste the different samples over the course of our session today, to maybe take some tasting notes if you have some paper or something like that, so that when we have a question and answer session at the end, you'll be able to kind of think back and reflect on how that tasting has gone as we progress through the different levels of percentage of cacao in the chocolate. Okay, that's it for this introduction. I want to get started with part one. I'm going to introduce Dr. Ciela Maximova, who will talk about the chocolate tree. She'll be followed by Dr. Hopfer for part one of our tasting, and we'll taste our first sample.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am so excited to talk to you today. I also earned my PhD degree from Penn State, so I'm really, really excited to share with you today a little bit more about our research and the chocolate tree. So every good chocolate bar starts with the cocoa bean, and I will tell you where that comes from today. Now, this is the cacao or the chocolate tree, Theobroma cacao in the wild. I think you can see my pointer, Helena, I can see it. Okay, so the cacao tree is this plant right here, and it's pretty tall, but it's still much less than a lot of the big trees in the Amazonian rainforest. And you can see a human here just for comparison. But the cocoa is a understory tree. It's a shady kind of a loving plant. And this is the cacao pot or the fruit of the cacao. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. Now, where is it grown? One of the reasons we like to talk about cacao is because it is grown in some of the most important and hot biodiversity spots in the world. You can see here, it's all around the equator. This is in Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, and also Asia. It is important to know that because the cacao plantations do have almost 75% of the biodiversity of natural rainforests, according to our collaborators in Panama. Now, a little bit closer look. Who eats chocolate? Well, Europeans, Americans, and everybody who doesn't really produce chocolate. This is the brown circles are the countries that grow the most cacao in the world. Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Ghana, and Cameroon in West Africa. Some countries in South America and Central America, and also in Asia. You can see that Europeans really eat a lot of chocolate. I'm personally from Bulgaria, and so chocolate is one of my most favorite food in the world. Now, who grows the cacao? As I mentioned, we in the Western developed society, we eat a lot of chocolate. But the people who grow cacao are the ones in the tropics. About 70% of the world cacao crops is grown by 5 to 6 million growers in very, very small farms. Farming is probably, for some of them, in most cases, rather, it's the only cash crop, and they use it to buy shoes, books, and send their kids to school. It really is a rural life kind of a thing. And if farmers stay on the plantations, they will prevent migration to the country, to the cities. Cacao is also very important as a substitution crop for coca in Peru and Colombia. And it's a very good environmental crop because it helps to protect the habitat, insects, birds, monkeys, and so on, as well as the watershed and the soil services. This is what really good cacao looks like in Ecuador. You can see here the fruits. They look like American football, and they're about the same size. They have many different colors, and you can see here, this is also in Ecuador, but it's a completely different variety of cacao, propagated by clonal propagation, just like many of the apple trees that are produced in the world. But most of the cocoa plantations are not so nice and clean and straight up in rows. This is a high intensity plantation in Ecuador. But in Brazil, this is the natural habitat where all the birds and the insects live. What you see here is the cocoa is really, really the lower vegetation. And then there's the large trees that are providing shade to the cocoa. The cocoa pots are many different colors, red, green, yellow, and so on. They also contain about 30 to 45 large and very, very bitter seeds. And so this is the different, not only the colors, but the variety of the pots is expressed into their form. You can see they're round and elongated and so on. So there's quite a bit of variation in cacao. And then Dr. Hopfer is going to talk to you about how that is actually reflecting into the flavor of the chocolate. Now here goes. This is the inside of the cocoa fruit. What you see in here is the cacao seeds that are extracted from the cocoa pod. And you can see the seeds can vary also in size and color and shape. And those are the friends of the cacao in the forest. They are monkeys and rats that eat the cocoa pods, and they spread the cacao seeds. That's how cacao travels. And it's propagated around the tropical rainforest. Now, the humans, they also collect the pods, but they use this large, very long pot, tool with a knife on the top to cut the pods. When the pods are collected, they are open and the seeds and the beans, or also we call them beads, are removed. The beans are then fermented, very much so like how we ferment wine. This is the cacao seeds in the bin, and the gentleman who you see in St. Lucia is mixing the beans to promote the fermentation. So the seeds are removed after 5 to 7 days from the fermentation bins, and they're dried. What you see here is the roof of the plantation in St. Lucia, and this is a roof where people bring on to close the drying area when it's raining. But you can see here that this is one of the most beautiful places on the Caribbean, and this is for Penn State field testing some of the cacao propagation technologies that we have developed. Now, after the cocoa is dried, we will put it in bags. And this is how the cocoa is stored for quite a long time. And this is one of the most important things about cacao. It could be stored in warehouses for a long time. It doesn't spoil. Well, it requires certain conditions, but in all, it's a very good cash crop for the farmers. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will let Dr. Hopfer continue and tell us how these beans actually get to be those tasty chocolates that we love so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ciela, for the nice introduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the beans get turned into chocolate, and then how suggested tasting steps, and then we're going to taste the first chocolate bar. So stay with me. It's not that much longer until you can start eating your first chocolate bar. All right, so we already covered, actually you have a cocoa pod in here. Cocoa pod gets opened, we get these tiny little seeds that are fermented and dried. Once they are dried, they're typically shipped in these burlap sacks and bags to chocolate producing countries like the United States, where they are roasted. They are cracked into pieces to remove the seed shells. And a cacao bean has about 50% fat. So when you grind the cacao, it forms this suspension of the melted cocoa butter, which melts at around body temperature, and the cocoa solids interspersed. They are typically conched, which is just mixing And in order to get this really nice chocolate bar with this typical shine and that typical snap, we need to make sure that we cool that chocolate bar in a controlled condition. That's called salt tempering, to allow the cocoa butter to crystallize in its most stable form. And in the end, you will end up with a chocolate bar. Okay. So what I'm going to talk to you about is how to evaluate chocolate. And this is a lot of the stuff that both my colleague, Dr. Hayes, and myself do in the Sensory Evaluation Center at Penn State. We're both sensory and consumer scientists. And we use humans to understand food products, but we also use food products to understand humans. A lot of our research is done on site in these individual tasting booths. They allow us to really control the conditions under which participants evaluate samples. So that woman in the top right corner, she's actually evaluating tiny little chocolate pieces, 100% chocolate pieces. And we even pinch her nose so that we can only measure what the basic taste sensations are. We also do quite a bit of non-food sensory science. So this is for the women's health product. We're trying to assess how is the product really needs to feel in order for people to evaluate it. And then lately, Dr. Hayes is part of this global consortium for chemosensory research, which is a global research team that really looks at these smell and taste losses due to COVID-19 infections. You might have heard about it. It's one of the, for some people, prevalent symptoms after COVID-19 infection, that they lose their sense of smell and taste. So a lot of work that we currently do is also related to COVID-19. Just to give you an idea what we do. Before we start tasting, I would like to talk to you why all those different steps and that I'm showing and sharing with you in a little second, why are they so important for how we evaluate chocolate? I'm really talking about how we can measure and how we can understand flavor. And flavor is this multisensory construct that our brain puts together based on different sensory inputs. Sensory inputs that come from our taste receptors that are in our oral cavity, on our tongue, and that detect sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and the fifth basic taste, umami. Umami is a Japanese word for savory or delicious, and it's describing these amino acids, protein rich foods. Smelling, both smelling through our nose as we typically think about it, but also we have a connection in the back of our oral cavity to our nasal cavity. And if you ever had something like water getting into the wrong pipe and it shoots out of your nose, that is the connection I'm talking about. So in the upper part of our nasal cavity, we have olfactory receptors, smell receptors that bind to different smell gas molecules. An important part of flavor is also the creaminess and the mouthfeel. We call this somatosensations. If you ever eat a dark chocolate bar or a chili pepper or a mint containing food, these astringency, drying, puckering, burning, and cooling sensations are technically neither a taste nor a smell. There are pain receptor activations. We call them chemothesis. And then the last portion of sound, think about the crunchiness of a potato chip or the lack of crunchiness of an older potato chip, and also about that snap that we might actually look at when we talk about the chocolate bars as well. And then last but not least, I know flavor is something we perceive in our mouth, and we don't have eyes in our mouth, but if it doesn't look right, we don't even get that far, right? If something doesn't look appealing, we might not even put it in our mouth. So flavor is really everything together, leading to this firework in our brain when we eat something. So you may want to start unwrapping your first chocolate bar now. What I did here, I have all 4 of them in front of me, unwrapped, and I want you, before you start eating, I know it's tempting looking at chocolate bars and not eating them immediately, but I want you to think about these so-called X-mouth experiences first. Ideally, you have a piece of paper and a pen so you can take notes, because every couple of 15 minutes, we're going to taste through another bar. So for each of those bars, you want to look at the appearance, look about the color, look about, is it shiny or not? You want to also handle it a little bit and think and do the sound combination. So does it snap? Does it make a loud sound or not? Also, how easy is it to break? And then you want to smell it. What does it smell like? And then can you actually describe it with words other than I like this or I don't like this? And this is what this wheel is on the right-hand side. It's the so-called chocolate flavor wheel. And what it does is you could either work yourself from the outside inwards or from the inside outwards. So the very generic terms here. So for example, caramel. So, okay, it smells like caramel. Well, what kind of caramel? Is it a milk caramel or is it more a sugar caramel smell? And then if you go even further out, is it a molasses sugar or is it a maple sugar? And this is really assisting you in putting words onto what you smell. So are you ready to put it in your mouth? Maybe put a small piece in your mouth, put it on the top of your tongue and push it up towards the roof of your mouth and let it sit there and melt. And as you inhale through your mouth and out through your nose, you might experience different aromas, different smells. You might also, as it melts, perceive different tastes, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami. You might perceive some drying or puckering, especially as we move from the lower cacao content to higher cacao content. Think about how it changes. Are there new sensations coming up as it's melting more and more? And once you swallow, what sensations are lingering around? So you can do this, take some notes at the very end. We can talk about this again, and I'm going to check in with you in a little bit. Thank you.
We have a question, if you don't mind me jumping in. Somebody is asking, does the cacao fruit, the white area around the seeds, have any use?
It is used sometimes for, like, people eat it. It's actually delicious. People make now some juices out of it, but typically it's not used broadly.
Great, thank you. We also have a question, which chocolate bar should they be tasting first?
I would recommend starting with the milk chocolate and then increase then the 70, 85, and 100%, but you can really start in any order, as long as you keep track.
Perfect, thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to take the first part of part 2. My name is Amara Solari. I'm a professor of art history and anthropology here at Penn State. And we have been talking so far about modern and contemporary chocolate production and experience and cultivation. And I'm going to take us way back into the ancient past. I like to say where it all began, where it all started, in the ancient Maya world. Many of you are probably familiar with this part of the world. We talk about it in terms of being ancient Mesoamerica. Ancient Mesoamerica is divided into many, many, many different cultural groups, ethnic groups, linguistic groups. But today I'm just going to be talking about the Mayas. And the Mayas inhabited this part of ancient Mesoamerica, specifically parts of the Yucatan Peninsula, what's today Belize, what's today Guatemala, what's today parts of Honduras and El Salvador. And you are probably familiar with the Maya because many of you maybe have gone on vacation to these lovely sites. This is an overview of Tikal right here. Scholars, we divide Maya history into all of these different time periods. Today, I'm primarily going to be looking at material that was made and used in the classic period, so right kind of in the middle of our chronology of the Maya, about the same time when these buildings were being built as well. And what I'm going to do today is that we're going to do a very, very brief overview of Maya ceramic production and see what ceramics tell us about the chocolate culture that was in use in Maya courtly contexts. So just a little bit before we start again, the Maya were never a unified empire. It actually wasn't until the 20th century that people who spoke any of the 32 dialects of Mayan actually considered themselves to be ethnically related. Instead, in this time period, in this classic period, so think 600, the Maya were divided into dozens of little city-states or kingdoms. If you're familiar with how ancient Greece divided itself up politically, it's a little bit like that with polities, and then dependent towns that provided tribute to the main capital city. So we're still discovering these towns and cities almost, I feel like, every field season. So our knowledge of ancient Maya culture is continually, and kind of political organization is continually developing. Maya society was extremely ordered in terms of a hierarchy, where at the very, very tip top, you had the rulers, or sometimes my students call them the kings, you had the religious specialists, the nobles, so on and so forth. The people who consumed chocolate tended to be those of the upper class. So we're looking at an elite practice here happening again in the courtly culture. I tell my undergraduates sometimes when you guys think about the Maya, I want you to think about civility and pomp and circumstance and artistic production that is really on par with coeval European courts. It's that complex, it's that complicated. So we know that cacao cultivation started thousands of years before the Maya were around, and probably didn't start in the Maya area. However, by the time of the classic period, again, it was an integral part of courtly decorum. So what are ceramics used for? Ceramics are our most abundance of material culture, mostly because they survive in the archaeological record. They are at the most elite level, they are polychromed, meaning that they are painted with multiple colors, as you can see 2 examples on the right. And they fulfill lots of different social functions, not just the very pragmatic function of being what you use to consume edibles. Instead, they're used during rituals, they reflect elite status, they create social and political connections because they're often given as gifts. We find them in tombs, so they're a form of funerary wear. And then of course, again, that pragmatic function of serving food. So what I'm going to show you is just very quickly a series of these vessels. These are about between 6 and 9 inches in height. All of the vessels I'm going to show you today were used to consume what we call a chocolate beverage, which I'm going to get to in just a second. I'm going to show you what we call the rollouts of these images. So this is the entirety of the scene rolled out in 2 dimensions. And in this scene, you see a courtly image. It's a courtly scene where the ruler is seated. I always like this one because like talk to the hand to the attendant here. But you can see he is imbibing chocolate drink. And you'll see that the shape of this vessel is reminiscent of the vessel that it's portrayed upon. So the images that are contained on the painted vessel surface actually lend insight into the prevalent nature of chocolate in Maya courts. They also tell us about how this chocolate drink was actually produced. And here on the famous Princeton vase, if you go to the Princeton University Art Museum, you'll see this vase highlighted. It's a very famous one. And one of the courtly attendants here is making a chocolate drink by pouring it between 2 vessels at a height. The idea was to take that fat that Helene had just spoken about and make it very frothy, bubbly. They wanted it to be agitated, and so it would bubble up. And we do have later accounts of the Maya that talk about this frothiness as being one of the best kind of the desired outcome of a chocolate beverage. We see earlier examples in the technology of chocolate pots. This pot, which I started with, this is a really, really old one. If the Princeton vase is maybe 650 CE, this dates to about year 0. So and it's a little bit outside the Maya area, but the frothiness is created by much the same way my children create frothiness with their straws when they're drinking chocolate milk. Actually, it's not a ceramicist, this is a stone carved vessel, but they've included this shaft here that allows the user to blow bubbles into the base of the vessel and thereby create that frothiness that later would be created using this technique. We also have a sense from these scenes how cacao functioned in terms of Maya politics. And here we have another court scene, two rulers seated in the middle, and it's come time for tribute payment. And these big sacks of cacao beans, not unlike what Dr. Maximova showed us just a few moments ago, are being given to this ruler as a form of tribute payment. So it's a way in which kind of inter-city politics and dynamics were established and maintained over the course of Maya history. But perhaps the biggest archaeological find in terms of the Maya and cacao happened in 1984 when a tomb, we call it Tomb 19, at the site called Rio Azul, you can see it located in northeastern Guatemala, was discovered, meaning archaeologists stumbled upon it. The site is known for having a whole series of tombs that are elaborately painted inside with lots of historical data. Tomb 19 included the remains of a middle-aged man and lots of different kinds of grave goods. So we're looking at an extremely wealthy individual, an elite, probably a ruler, included about 14 different ceramic vessels in addition to other things. The most famous of which today is this, what we call the Rio Azul chocolate pot. And you can see that this is a globular shaped vessel, and it has an interlocking lid. So when you put the lid on and you twist it, whatever the contents were inside would not be able to spill out. It also was placed upon a brazier so it could actually be put flame under here and keep the contents warm. Because as we'll talk about perhaps in a little while, chocolate needs to be a little bit warm to maintain its liquid form. So it was not only the form of the vessel that was unique, but actually these elements, which are glyphs, written onto the side. And in 1985, so just 1 year after the discovery of the tomb, David Stewart, who's a famous Maya epigrapher who works at UT Austin, was able to discover this glyph right here and break it down into its syllabic parts. And we know now that it says cacao, so ka-ka-wa. It's exactly the same, our English term cacao, obviously being derived from this Mayan term. Not only that, Dr. Stewart was able to decipher all of the glyphs around the band, and he came up with this particular translation. So this vessel is saying very clearly, it is his cup for something called witik cacao, and for something else called kokshomul cacao. This lets us know, even though we don't know the particulars, that individuals had particular recipes for that cacao drink that they were known, were named. We just don't know exactly what were in them. We know that Maya used to add spices, used to add sweeteners like honey, all sorts of different things. So these are particular cacao drink recipes. And so the idea was that in 1984 and 1985, that this vessel was purely used for chocolate consumption. And then lo and behold, the Hershey lab ran an analysis in 1987, so just a couple of years later, in which they confirmed the presence of the two diagnostic chemicals in cacao, theobromine and caffeine. These, correct me if I'm wrong, plant scientists, but it's my understanding that the cacao is the only New World species of plant that has both of these chemicals in, I guess, this particular ratio. So confirming through residue analysis that this pot was in fact probably buried with cacao in its globular bottom when this person was interred. And I think with that, we can move on to the early modern period. Oh no, we have another tasting, sorry.
Before we jump into that next tasting, we do have a couple of questions. One is, when tasting different chocolates, do you need a liquid or a solid to cleanse the palate between them?
So what works really well is like not too cold water, maybe even a little bit above room temperature, body temperature, not too hot. It definitely will linger. So water, not too cold water works quite well. You could also like swish it around quite a bit.
Perfect. We've got 2 more questions and then we'll get into that next tasting. The next one is, does chocolate really have so much caffeine that it keeps people up at night, or is that a myth?
So both theobromine and caffeine are both stimulants. So they are able to, have stimulating properties similar to caffeine and coffee or tea. Depends how much chocolate you eat and how high the cocoa content is as well, and how sensitive you are. I mean, I guess if you eat lots of high cocoa content and you are a sensitive person, you may be able to get, it's not as high as in coffee. Yeah.
So maybe mix your coffee and your chocolate if you're looking for that caffeine.
With a double whammy, yes.
Perfect. Last question here. Are there any study abroad programs where people specifically study chocolate?
You mean for students at Penn State?
The question doesn't specify, but yes, let's start with students at Penn State that maybe you're aware of.
Not that I know of, but that's a great idea. Ciela,
right.
do you know any of that?
I think this is an excellent idea, and we have been thinking about it. There have been a couple of pilot programs, but there is not really a specific chocolate study abroad. But I will take a note of that for sure. Thank you.
Great, we will get on to that next tasting then.
All right, welcome back. So let's move on to sample number 2, and we'll do the same steps again. And you could always compare and contrast. That helps really well. So my second sample is the 70% chocolate cocoa content. And compared to the milk chocolate, it's definitely darker. Let's see if we can actually hear a difference when I snap it. Definitely louder. It also breaks a bit more difficult and less easy than the milk chocolate. And then the smell should quite be different as well. So what I notice is really hard to put descriptors onto things that we smell. You're not alone, but you can really train yourself. And again, that chocolate flavor wheel here can really help you. If you thought about the milk chocolate had a lot of caramel notes, and there was still some chocolate, maybe not to the degree of like a dark brownie, but definitely some chocolate. There were also some dairy notes quite a bit. I don't know if any of you had got an association with vomit or baby poop. Or not. We're not tasting Hershey chocolate, but this milk chocolate has very caramelly notes and dairy notes, in my opinion. Now moving to that 70% cocoa content, that's quite a different aroma as well. And as you put it in your mouth and let it melt, just keep trying, taking notes and see what other aromas, tastes, mouthfeels, and temporal changes. How long does it take to melt compared to the first one, for example? And what are the lingering sensations after swallowing? So I'll leave that up a little bit more, and then I think we could move on to the next portion.
Ciela, would you be able to share your screen? Thank you. Hi again, everyone. What I'd like to do is to continue on from Dr. Solari's discussion of cacao and chocolate among the ancient Maya and bring us into the colonial period, and specifically the 15th to 17th centuries. And if you could move to the next slide, please. As we've stated, chocolate and cacao trees are indigenous to the Americas. And so during the 16th to the 17th centuries, Europeans were tasting chocolate for the first time. Chocolate was among one of 3 new beverages that kind of entered European markets and were available to Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries, along with coffee and tea. This happened through European colonial expansion across the globe and the development of a truly global trade network, one that especially focused on luxury goods, and chocolate, tea, and coffee were among those goods. And so one of the things that, given that this is chocolate and cacao are an indigenous plant and consuming it is an indigenous process, processing it also is an indigenous knowledge, Europeans had to sort of figure out scientifically, botanically, medically, culturally, in culinary sense too, how to deal with it, how to work with this plant and its product, the cacao. And so you had publications like this image on the right, which is a French work from the late 17th century, introducing these three beverages: coffee, tea, and chocolate to the Americas. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about it is the association of these different beverages with specific cultural groups. And I'm going to highlight here, these are allegorical associations. This is a very common way that Europeans visually represented and associated cultures with specific food products. And you'll see this kind of allegory of an indigenous person with what Europeans would recognize as the stereotypical feathered headdress and feathered clothing, along with the, if you can see with my arrow is, the bow and arrow here as well. And so this is like cementing the link between, in European minds, in terms of how they're spreading information about chocolate consumption to indigenous cultures of the Americas. We can also see in this image that the material culture that's associated with chocolate consumption, and some of these we saw in the very beautiful rollout vases and representations on those vases that Dr. Solari showed us. So for example, here at the bottom, at the base of the foot of the indigenous person is a chocolate pot where the chocolate would be heated up. To the left of it is a little instrument called a molonillo. And it's an instrument that basically serves to froth the chocolate, to get that bubbliness that everybody kind of desires as part of that kind of sensory experience of chocolate consumption, that they would go like this and kind of raise bubbles up of the chocolate. And then you can see the indigenous person consuming chocolate in what was probably like a gourd-like shaped or a cup-like shaped, and you can tell it's hot chocolate, right? It's heated because you can see the heat images kind of going above the chocolate here. And so we can also see, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but in the center is associating tea with Chinese culture, and to the left is associating coffee with Middle Eastern culture. And so, Europeans, when they saw pretty much right from the start, from the Cortez expedition in Mexico, Cortez himself and members of his army were mentioning chocolate, their curiousness about it, consuming it themselves. And so they began to kind of set in motion this longstanding and intense botanical, medical, and scientific interest in chocolate, in cacao trees, in their fruits, in chocolate drink preparation, right from the start of colonialism. And Europeans, in order to kind of learn information about this, they depended on learning knowledge about the plant and its products from indigenous scientists and other specialists. And then they had to kind of take that information, organize it, and present it to European readers. And so this work that I'm showing you here, this French work, would be sort of one of those kinds of publications. And these were all bestsellers at the time. People were very eager to not only taste it, but also kind of learn more about this product. And if you could go to the next slide, please. And I want to give you two examples of kind of the way that Europeans were kind of scientifically, medically, and culinarily interested in chocolate, and kind of how they gathered information and how they presented it to European readers. And the first example that I want to show you here is what's known as the Florentine Codex by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. This is a bilingual encyclopedic work on Nahua culture, science, moral discourse, natural history, Nahua sacred beliefs. It's bilingual in Spanish and the Nahuatl language, which is the language of indigenous peoples of central Mexico. It was written in collaboration with Sahagún, who himself was a priest, and he was bilingual himself, working with a team of indigenous Nahua scribes, scientists, and painters to produce this multi-volume encyclopedic work that's considered a world treasure this time. one of the interesting things about this work is that it shows a really important example of cross-cultural exchanges of scientific, botanical, and other kinds of knowledge that was happening, not just at contact, but for the next number of centuries afterwards, about products that were as important as cacao and chocolate. Next slide, please. And then just to give you an example or a feel for how that information was sort of gathered and then represented through things like the Florentine Codex, this is the entry for chocolate, for cacao, for the cacao tree from the Florentine Codex. And you can see on the left that we can see some similarities to what Dr. Maximova was showing us in her presentation. And in particular, you can see those very kind of bright red pods that are American football shaped. And this is the entry from it. It says the tree that they harvested the cacao from is called a cacao cavit. It has wide leaves and a medium-sized cup-shaped fruits that look like ears of corn. The inside is filled with cacao beans and the outside is purplish and the inside flesh colored or bright red. And those who drink a lot of it become drunk, and those who drink it moderately feel cool and refreshed. So even just in this one little short entry, we can see quite a lot of information that's being conveyed to the reader. The writers are mentioning its Nahuatl name, right? So they've got that there as well. It's describing what it looks like, especially in terms of colors and size. We can see the fruits being compared to something that Europeans would have been familiar with, so ears of corn. And when Dr. Maximova showed us kind of a cut open cacao pod, you could see those big things there that look like kernels of corn. And it's interesting because corn is actually indigenous to the Americas too, but by the late 16th century or so, it kind of tells us also that corn itself, Europeans are becoming more familiar with American food products. And then another really interesting part at the end of that is describing how cacao consumption affects the human body. If you drink too much, you sort of feel drunk. So that might kind of refer to those stimulant properties that Dr. Hopfer was talking about. But if you drink it in moderation, you feel cool and refreshed. Next slide, please. And then the second example that I want to show you of this kind of cross-cultural, scientific, cultural collaboration is through the work of a German-born naturalist and painter named Maria Sibylla Merian, who lived and worked in the second half of the 17th century and the early 18th century. She grew up being interested in raising and studying insects, and she was especially interested in the metamorphosis of butterflies and moths. She led a very interesting life, kind of late in life after she had raised her family to adults. She traveled in 1699 to 1701 on a scientific expedition to Dutch Suriname, which is located in northern South America, bringing with her one of her adult daughters who helped her. And she spent those years studying and painting the relationships between insects, plants, and the environment. And this is a slide from one of her works. And she published these beautiful paintings in a number of works. Some of you may have already heard of her as well, but the one that this particular slide comes from, translated into English as Insect Metamorphosis in Dutch Suriname, that was published in Amsterdam in 1705, and it is a Dutch and Latin text. And if you can move on to the next slide, please. And then just to kind of show you a little bit larger version of this and to just kind of dive into all the information, the scientific, the botanical, the insect information that's being conveyed here just in this one plate. One thing that I'd like you to notice are the 4 variations of cacao pod growth. You can see that on the right side, you can see it from the small beginning cacao fruits as they're developing on the tree, all the way through to a fully mature cacao pod that's ready to be harvested with the red seeds inside. And then in the upper left, you can see an armyworm at different stages of metamorphosis and the resulting moth. And this is a family of, from the family of night flyers of the order of Lepidoptera. And One of the things that Marion acknowledges in the writings that sort of accompany these beautiful paintings and illustrated plates is she acknowledged the collaborations that she had, even if she didn't name the people, with indigenous people, with slaves, with servants, because Marion was a newcomer. If any of you know anything about Dutch Suriname, kind of in northern South America, it's a jungly area. It's a kind of landscape and ecosystem that Marion would not have been familiar with. And so she was a newcomer and she depended on those kinds of relationships that she was able to develop. In addition to showing this kind of cross-cultural knowledge exchange, we also see the complexity of the ecosystem and the kind of intersections that the cacao plant has with other plants and with insects as well. And I'm gonna let us move on to the next tasting. Take it away, Dr. Hopper.
All right, so I think as you probably experienced moving from the first milk chocolate sample to the first dark chocolate sample, that was quite a jump in flavor profile. So let's move on to the third sample, the 85% cocoa. Again, compare and contrast the color. It's definitely getting even more darker in the brown direction. And then let's listen to the snap. All right, snaps a little bit louder than before, about the same pressure that you need to snap it. If you smell it, we're definitely not in a milk chocolate land anymore. So you, again, feel free to use the flavor wheel to kind of assist you with putting words onto what you sense and what you perceive. And then really let it melt in your mouth. And I think it's actually fabulous to eat chocolate while you listen to the history of chocolate and cacao throughout the world and throughout the times. So we are going to talk about about the different things at the very end. Just keep notes and we're going to move on with genetics of cacao.
Okay, hello everybody. Can you hear me? We're good? Okay, thanks a lot, everybody. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the advanced research we're doing at Penn State on the chocolate tree, Theobroma cacao. And the next slide, please. One of the things I want to tell you about is our work to study the genome of the cacao. So you might wonder what is a genome. And here you see a picture of cacao leaf cells. Each one of those little boxes is a cell. And you see the little green circles. Those are the nucleus of the cell. That's where all the DNA for each cell is. And the DNA has all the instructions to grow and build a cacao plant and actually to make all the molecules that are involved in chocolate. The little red dots actually are chloroplasts. So that's a different compartment. That's where all the photosynthesis happens. So a genome, again, contains all the DNA for an organism, and it has all the instructions needed to build that organism. And basically, it's a long stretch of 4 basic chemicals. You maybe have heard of the A, C, and GT nucleotides that are the building blocks of DNA. In cacao, we discovered there's about 430 million individual DNA bases. So one of the things we did was to set out to determine the sequence of all those bases. And that's what we call sequencing a genome. So the next slide talks about why we would want to do that. And the reason is from studying the cacao genome, we can discover all the genes. And it's the genes that are the important cacao resistant to plant diseases and of traits. So once we can understand what's the genetics behind those important traits, we can use breeding. We can speed up breeding. Using traditional breeding, it takes 20 to 30 years to breed one new variety of cacao. But with accelerated breeding using molecular biology, down to 10 years. And that's really important because the cacao farmers really need better plants so they can get better yields. They can fight diseases better. They don't need to use chemicals and other things. So basically, that's our contribution to trying to reach sustainability in cacao farming. The next slide just is a very brief summary of how we did that. We basically took leaves, we isolate DNA from the leaves, and then we sequence, we do a reaction, a chemical reaction called DNA sequencing. And we sequence.
Could you please turn off your camera because it's breaking up and we cannot hear you very well.
Okay, sorry about that. I hope that's a little better. I have a weak connection here.
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So again, what I was saying, if you didn't catch that, is how do we sequence the genome? We isolate the DNA from leaves, and then we break it up into millions of little pieces, actually billions of little pieces. And then using some very advanced machinery, we're able to determine the sequence of all those little pieces. And then we put them back together like a giant jigsaw puzzle to get the entire sequence of the genome. There's 10 chromosomes in each cacao genome. The next slide, please. I'm gonna tell you a little bit what we found. So once we got all that data, we had, by the way, this is a large team of about 50 scientists working on this, an international team. Penn State was just one of the partners. We found over 28,000 genes, which is pretty interesting. That's actually more genes than in the human genome, if you can believe that. So in a certain way, plants are more complicated than even humans. And not only that, but we could compare all those genes to genes in other species. And we found over 2,000 genes that were only found in cacao. And that's a very interesting feature of the genome. What do those unique genes do? We are especially interested in disease resistance. And a plant has an immune system just similar to human immune system. Plants don't have antibodies, but they have many other mechanisms to fight viruses and fungi and other kinds of pathogens. So we looked for those. We actually found very many disease resistance genes. Actually now we have found over 1,000 genes we think are associated with disease resistance. So it's a very complicated feature of the cacao genome. We also started looking for key quality traits, things that you're tasting right now, like the bitterness genes in particular. So a lot of the bitterness comes from the flavonoids. And the cocoa butter, the thing that makes it very smooth, comes from basically the lipids or the oils in the seeds. And a lot of the good flavors, the smells and the all kinds of different flavors that you can taste, a lot of those involve a class of molecules called the terpenoids. So we're studying the biosynthesis of all of those important molecules that have to do with quality traits in the seeds. And you can see there's around 100 genes for each one of those traits. And what we're doing is using the discovery, the way we make it useful is to translate that into molecular markers, again, that breeders can use to speed up breeding. And there's a lot of really great basic science that's coming out of this too, that doesn't have to do with like crop improvement, but just to study the evolution of plants and the evolution in general. We're able to use cacao as a model plant to study genome evolution because we have lots of plants that were collected deep in the Amazon basin, and it's a really nice system to study evolution. And yeah, we found a lot of these things called transposable elements. You can see there's over 67,000 transposable elements in the cacao genome. Those are little bits of DNA that actually can move around the genome. They can come in and out of the genome and change the way the genome functions, change the way that a variety looks, or maybe the way it even tastes. And we have started studying those as well. So finally, all that work was published in Nature Genetics. In the same issue, the strawberry genome was published, so we got a beautiful cover for that the day after Christmas in 2010. And I just wanted to end this presentation to say, that's just the one group that Ciela and I lead that working on cacao, and you've also met the other scientists here today. But we actually have a large group from 4 colleges, 9 departments, many different topics spanning from social sciences and art, as you've heard, all the way to molecular biology, consumer science, business, and so on. So we have a very large group we call the Cacao and Chocolate Research Network. If you want to learn more about that, we have a website, you could learn more about it. And I think that's it for me. I'll turn it over to the last, I think, tasting sample.
Thank you, Mark. So doesn't chocolate taste better the more you know about it? I do think so. Okay, so let's move on to our last sample, which is for me at least, the 100% cacao one. Again, do your spiel, you're experts by now. How does it look like? What's the sound? Especially the snap, let's see. All right, all indicating really well-tempered chocolate. Let's look at the aroma. Dark chocolate for sure. And then as you wanna, melt it in your mouth, I think we can probably, let's see, we can probably have Martha give a conclusion, or how do we want to do this? Do we want to take questions now?
Yeah, take some questions.
Great. We have a lot of questions that have come in, so I'm just going to start asking them, and then whoever is the correct faculty member to answer them, go ahead and jump in.
And
the first one.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Martha.
No, I was going to say we can turn on our cameras. Yeah, if you can.
Great. I believe that there is evidence of chocolate being consumed in South America in what is now Ecuador. This was before the Mayan use of chocolate. Can you confirm this?
That can go to either myself or Dr. Maximova. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's looking more and more like the earliest cultivation of cacao is happening in the Amazonian basin up against Ecuador, not the Maya area. Unfortunately, we don't have as good of material culture in that area to sustain that. I can't do a very pretty presentation with the material culture from that part of the world. And I'm a Mayanist by training, so I tend to focus on the Maya area for that reason. But yes, you're absolutely right. Ciela?
I don't have anything to add to it. You're correct, but we don't really, this is just the beginning of those discoveries. And correct me if I'm wrong, Amara and Mark, but there's also some evidence in Peru as well for some of those earlier findings.
That's right. And it's mostly just residue analysis or chemical analysis. So again, it's not figurative images that I can show you kind of the larger social role of chocolate consumption in those areas.
Yeah, there was actually collaborators of ours from France who went into Ecuador, and they found vessels, and they got some scrapings. But in this case, it's even better evidence than what was found for the Mayans, in that they actually sequenced small bits of DNA, very old DNA that was in these vessels, and could show that DNA came from a cacao plant. So we have super definitive evidence that that is in the area in the, I guess that's the southeastern corner of Ecuador, which is right on the border of Peru. And we think there are civilizations. There's a lot of similarities and movement between those areas. So we think definitely in Peru also people were using it. Whether they were cultivating cacao, we don't know, because in those same areas, there's lots of wild cacao. So they might have been just harvesting wild cacao.
Great. Somebody's asking or saying they've never had Lindt chocolate before and they're enjoying it. Any particular reason why you suggested it?
One of the major reasons why we selected the Lindt chocolates was that they're widely available, they don't cost a fortune, and they do a nice job highlighting what the cocoa content differences, what kind of differences the cocoa content can make. So moving from, like a cocoa content different from 15%, 70 to 85, 85 to 100, those are very different chocolate bars. And I don't know how many of you have had 100% chocolate before, but I mean, you know, your immediate reaction might be, ooh, I don't know, but this is actually quite tasty, in my opinion. So again, you know, liking is highly subjective, but I think it's a nice demonstration of what the effect of cocoa content is on flavor.
Thank you. To that end, somebody's also curious to know, why is dark chocolate better for you than milk chocolate?
So a colleague of ours at Penn State, Josh Lambert, did actually do an epidemiological study based on a lot of published data, and found that really any chocolate is good for you, not just dark chocolate. Any chocolate is good for you, is associated with lower cardiovascular disease risk, you know, across, I don't know, 5,000 people that were followed over. We don't really exactly know. Some of the indications might be because the polyphenol content, the flavonoids, is higher in darker chocolate. That might be good for you. The sugar content is lower as well. But we do know that there's a lot of stuff in cacao and chocolate that we don't know the actual mechanism. We just know that any chocolate that you consume is probably, you know, leading to positive and beneficial health outcomes. And you know what? If it doesn't hurt you, at least it tastes good.
That's always a good answer when it comes to chocolate. Is the cacao leaf susceptible to certain insects?
Okay, I'll take that one. Mark, would you like to respond?
Sure, I can take that one. Yeah, it is, and it is, but it's not a major factor in limiting cacao production. There are some insects that do chew on the leaves. There's a bad one in West Africa called mirids, but there's another that does impact leaves. But there's a really bad insect in Asia called cocoa pod borer. They don't really bother the leaves, but they go straight into the pods, and then the pod becomes infected and you lose the whole pod.
Okay, thank you for that answer, Mark. There is a Chicago company that makes chocolate bars with some odd combinations of flavors, but it says on the wrapper, our chocolate is infused with a 528 Hz healing sound frequency to raise your vibe. Is that just a marketing tactic?
I would say so.
The Vogue chocolate?
Yes, that is just a marketing tactic.
Yes.
So you can't infuse chocolate with sound? Is that what we're saying? We feel pretty strongly about that?
I'm sure you could try. Might
enough.
not do much.
Is it true Belgium chocolate is the best?
Well, now we can have a discussion on that one, Helena.
So I think it really comes down to your personal preference, right? If somebody tells you, I don't know, this red dress is the best looking, and you're like, no, it looks disgusting, you're okay. But why would you have anyone tell you which chocolate is the best? If it's the best for you, great. If it's not the best for you, also great. You'll find a chocolate that you like. I'm very frustrated by having certain experts tell you what is good and what is bad, because in the end it comes to your personal preference, what you like to eat and what you don't like to eat.
I think that's also true.
I mean, I would add, for my perspective, Belgian chocolate is really exceptionally good and smooth, especially their bonbons. I love the really fancy ones.
Well, but for me, every week I have a favorite chocolate. So sometimes it's the Belgium. Most of the times it's something else and new.
I like Latin American chocolate, so Central America, Northern South America.
It's
The one
completely personal preference.
The one interesting thing though is once you start looking for different cacao beans, so for example, finding chocolates that were made with cacao beans that come from different countries in Central America, South America, and you start tasting them and comparing them, you are just amazed about the variety of flavors. And we're not even talking about chocolates that have inclusions like nuts and stuff added. We are talking about chocolates that just have cocoa beans and sugar and maybe some cocoa butter, and that's it. And they taste so different. And I think that is a lot of the appeal about chocolate too, that you have this wide array of flavor that just comes from the Theobroma cacao plant. And then you start adding all the other stuff too.
So here's a question. Has chocolate ever been used as medicine?
I guess I can take that. That's a really big discussion in the colonial period and early modern Europe, in part fueled by the way people describe chocolate making them feel. And so you'll remember from that excerpt that I read to you that people describe if they eat quite a lot of chocolate, they drink a lot of it, they feel drunk. But if they eat it moderately, they feel cool and refreshed. And that's really linking up with European understandings of what health is, and keeping the body in balance makes it healthy. And so if you imbibe too much, it makes you feel drunk, it makes you feel overstimulated. But if you do it in moderation, you feel cool and refreshed. And so sort of an argument about the healthful properties of chocolate consumption, but if it goes too far, what it does to the body.
Thank you, Martha. European and American chocolates seem to taste different because of the level of paraffin. Are there other reasons in the processing that might change the taste?
I'm not sure about the paraffin. I don't know what that means. Typically, there's no paraffin in chocolate. The one big difference that may be apparent is if you taste the milk chocolate like the Lindt compared to milk chocolate like a Hershey bar, they are very different. And that is really dependent on Hershey chocolate uses fresh milk, and European milk chocolate, most of the cases uses milk powder. And just due to processing, you create different flavors. So there's that big difference. To be honest, as far as I know, the European codex for chocolate is actually stricter, what you can call a chocolate, than the United States codex. Yeah.
Thanks, Helene. What is the difference between a Hershey milk chocolate bar from 1900 versus today?
The different wrapper paper. As far as I know, the process is pretty similar. It is definitely modernized. They still use fresh milk powder, fresh milk instead of the milk powder, because it's really about this very characteristic Hershey flavor. Ciela?
What I wanted to add is, yes, they have changed a little bit the wrappers, but over the years, depending on the economy, and especially during the Depression, the chocolate bars have gone smaller and smaller. They were much bigger. And so also today, chocolate bar is only one of the products for Hershey. So they have many different products, and a lot of them deviate from the specific, this very familiar and Hershey flavor that we all used to and accustomed to. So yeah, I think the process is the same, just like Helena said, but the shape and how big the chocolate bar is has changed over time. And actually the wrapper, not so much. Also, there's some modern design to it, but it still continues to have this kind of a traditional look to it.
Thank you. Here's a question from somebody who is paying attention to the back of their wrapper while they were tasting their chocolate. They noticed that the 100% bar has the highest number of calories, but the lowest sugar content. Why is that?
That really comes back to remember that a cacao bean contains about 50% cocoa butter, which is fat. So this really, most of the calories come from the fat. So if you look at the fat levels of these, and you do have to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples, because the serving size on the 100% is 50 grams or 1 bar, and the serving size on the other ones is 3 pieces or 30 grams. So you do need to make sure that you compare on the same level. So 30 grams have 170 calories. So if you switch from 30 to 50 grams, you're actually not that far off with the calories. So make sure that you compare apples to apples.
It's a good tip. How does red wine affect the taste of chocolate?
You tell me, taste it.
Well, I don't think that we have an option for the audience to chime in, but
Maybe next year.
maybe next year we can do wine and chocolate. How about that? I don't know if we're allowed to because we cannot control for age difference, but the reality is that I strongly recommend that people take chocolate, different kinds of chocolate and different kinds of wine, and you do a little chocolate and wine tasting yourself, and you will actually find that it's quite amazing how they pair or also despair, because you cannot taste some of the chocolate with particular wines. I personally find that there is a very special wine from southern France on the border of Spain. It's called Banyuls. Banyuls is a kind of a sweet wine, and it's one of the best wines to have with dark chocolate. So I very strongly recommend that. Helena, do you have anything else?
Just from personal experiences, sweeter, lighter, and whiter wines tend to pair easier than darker red tannic wines. But again, that depends on the chocolate. So dark chocolate typically work better with like a sweeter wine in my experience. But again, you are your own, try it out.
You guys, we have a few more questions. Thanks for all of these great answers so far. Here's one from an alumni who wants to know, what are your thoughts on ruby chocolate?
You want to take that one, Helena?
So ruby chocolate was recently introduced by a particular company and is claimed to be the fourth type of chocolate. So white chocolate, milk chocolate, dark chocolate, ruby chocolate. It's still made from cacao beans. It seems that it's a special treatment of the beans during fermentation that preserve. So a lot of the cacao beans, when they're before fermentation, they often are purple. They have a lot of so-called anthocyanins that turn into brown pigments during fermentation. But depending on how the fermentation is handled, you can preserve a lot of this purple color that is then leading to ruby color. And there seems to be also some manipulation with some of the organic acids that are naturally present in the cacao as well. It is a patented process, and I have yet to look up the patent to really know for sure what it is. But it's still chocolate, so, and it's pretty. So I don't know how many bakers of you are out there. That ruby chocolate for like, you know, as a glazing or something is really spectacular. And it does taste a little different. It's more on the fruity sour side, has a lot of sugar as well in there typically.
Oh, I actually have one of the original ruby samples. So you can see that it looks kind of pink. And I recommend, so this is a product of Berry Calibu chocolate. For those of you who don't know, go and grab some and taste it. It's very interesting because the flavor is quite acidic, but you could take it as citrus or as acid. So take a look. That's I'm sorry, this is kind of small, but these are tasting samples.
I know at one point Trader Joe's had them as in little droplets, you know, chocolate chips. I don't know if they have them at the moment, but that's where I found some.
You can see what they look like.
Thank you, guys. What's the most unusual chocolate recipe you're aware of? Something you might not normally think of?
Amara and Martha, you want to take that?
Sure. one of the things we talk about in class is some of these historic recipes for chocolate. So I can mention a couple, and Amara can talk about maybe some of the way Maya's prepared it. But the way that Europeans were really fascinated with both integrating in what were considered indigenous products, so spices, especially spicy chili pepper, vanilla beans, but then they could put in all sorts of different kinds of materials to try to enhance the healthful properties of chocolate in the colonial period. And so there are these wonderful kind of starting also in the same time period, 16th and 17th centuries, medicinal guidebooks or medicinal recipes, as well as culinary recipes for like the early form of like chocolate ice cream and things like that, and brownies and things like that. And Mara?
If we go further back, of course, all over Mesoamerica, there are recipes for moles, right, which many of you might know of, and that's a savory sauce that's made out of ground roasted chocolate beans, usually put on different kinds of meat or kind of roasted meats, or on top of things like tamales that have, you know, different kinds of things inside of them. And these are very regional. So in the Maya area, almost every single village has it, or maybe down to the family, has its own recipe for a particular kind of mole. Today, it's most famous probably in the Oaxacan region, so the western part of Mexico. But in the pre-Columbian era, actually one of the vessels I showed you showed at the very bottom a plate of tamales that had a kind of deep red brown sauce on it, and that was probably a kind of mole.
Can I share my screen for just 1 second? So for those of you who are into weird chocolate, I kind of have a feeling that this is the company that has to do with like the sound and all that. But this company has all kinds of flavors. It's a company out of Chicago. You can see here Parmesan, walnut, and fig. They have all kinds of different flavors. So I would recommend that if you really want to taste something unique, you should try this company. I'm not saying that this is the best chocolate. I'm saying they have many different flavors.
There are a couple more companies too that play with different flavor combinations as well. So just, you know, go on the internet and see.
We're going to take a few more questions here and then we'll wrap up. I'm going to ask some questions that are maybe a little less about how chocolate tastes and some of the science parts. So has someone studied the impact of chocolate consumption on the subcortical areas of the brain that are associated with pleasure, hormone production, emotion, and memory?
Probably. I can't say from the top of my head, nothing comes to my mind, but I do know that health properties on specific mechanistic approaches are currently studied.
Great,
Yes.
thanks.
The answer is yes. There are studies that are conducted some people are still doing it, on how chocolate binds to different receptors in the brain, or some of the volatiles or some of the compounds. And I would recommend, without going too much into further details, that if you're interested in this, you can either send me an email or just do a little bit more research. But there are some of those chemicals bind to some of the cannabinoid receptors. I don't want to say this loud, but yes, there are studies that showing specific brain activities related to chocolate.
Thank you. What's the best way to store your chocolate, and what is Dutch processed chocolate?
That's your specialty, Elena.
So the one important thing for a chocolate bar, and I think you've all had that happen to you, don't store it too warm. So once it reaches over body temperature or like 100 Fahrenheit, it starts to melt, and then this nice little snap, and you get, it looks like mold, but it's really just the fat that drifts on top of the bar. And once you start putting it in your mouth, it doesn't have this nice melting properties. It's really crumbly. It might still, the flavors might still be the same, but it has a very different texture. I store a lot of my chocolate in the fridge in an airtight container. Because of the fat, picks up a lot of the other aromas very quickly. So you don't want to store it next to your bacon unless you want to try a bacon chocolate combination, or next to your, I don't know, pickled herring or whatever, unless you want to try that out. So it's like a sponge when it comes to taking up other flavors. And then just don't store it, just eat it as quickly as possible. Yeah, I forgot the second part of the question.
Dutch processed chocolate. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that is a process that is particularly used for cocoa powder. And it's basically you take the roasted cacao powder and you treat it with a strong alkali, which basically reduces the astringency and the bitterness, leads to darker color, and also enhances the dispersibility. So if you compare a normal cocoa powder and the Dutch processed cocoa powder, and you want to make like yourself a cocoa drink, similar to what Amara and Martha are talking about, it's definitely easier to disperse it if it's a Dutch processed one.
Great, that sounds like a good tip for us to keep in mind this winter in case anyone's making hot chocolate. Same theme, is the chocolate that's used for cooking and baking the same as the chocolate we were trying today?
If you look at the ingredient label on the back, most baker's chocolate is 100% chocolate. Typically, there is no cocoa butter added to it and no vanilla, for example. So if you look at your 100% chocolate bar wrapper, it says chocolate, cocoa powder processed with alkali and cocoa butter. So this has chocolate and then cocoa butter. And on top of that, they also add more fat just to get that melting behavior going. For cooking or baker's chocolate, you typically don't have that. But other than that, I cook with all of these and I also eat the stuff I cook with. So I'm less discriminatory when it comes to my chocolate consumption. I'll try everything, but there is a slight difference. And if you want to know what it is, just look at the ingredient list.
Thank you. Here's a question about the cacao plant. What's the lifespan and how much does it yield each year?
Excellent questions. The cacao plants can live very long time. They can be 100 years old and still be alive and healthy. However, just like most of the plantation plants and the orchard plants, they only have a certain span of during their lifetime that they can really be very productive. And so we recommend that the cacao plantations are rehabilitated and the plants are renewed maybe like every 20 years. If we talk about the cacao yield per hectare, let's say, the potential of when we have a really good cacao plants, when they're taken really well for and they are good varieties, we can have up to anywhere between 1 ton to 4 tons per hectare. However, the cacao farmers in the world are suffering quite a bit because the average cacao yield is about 0.4 tons per hectare. So you can see that the potential of the cacao to produce fruit in the plantations is way underutilized. It's not realized. Basically, we can make 3 or 4 or 5 times more per hectare if we have good varieties and they're taken care of, which would be really good for preserving the rainforest, because the non-productive cacao caused farmers to abandon their lands, and they move and then they destroy more rainforest. So this is a really, really important question for cacao producers, for cacao scientists, for the companies themselves, because farmers are very poor. And part of the reason is because they're producing very small amount of cacao compared to what they could actually produce. So I know this is a very long answer, but it was a very good question, and thank you for asking.
Thanks, that's a great answer. I appreciate you taking your time to get into that. We're going to do 2 more questions here and then we'll wrap up and let you guys say goodbye. The next question is, what are cocoa nibs or cacao nibs?
Cacao nibs are, remember that process from the cacao tree all the way to the chocolate bar. So after roasting, you take the roasted cacao beans and you break them apart into smaller pieces to remove the shells. And those smaller pieces are called cacao nibs. So they're really pieces of roasted cacao. So 100% cacao.
Thank you. What's the major difference between American and European chocolate? And this person is also wondering if Europeans actually hate Hershey chocolate. I don't know if you guys know that.
So I am from Austria, so I am a European.
We should stick to politically correct answers.
Yeah, so I'll tell you.
I eat chocolate.
There is one generation of Europeans that really likes Hershey chocolate, and that is the generation that were small kids right after World War II, when the US soldiers came over and shared Hershey chocolate with them. And that was the only chocolate that was available. I told you a bit about the difference, how Hershey chocolate is made with fresh milk versus a lot of the European chocolate is made with milk powder. And due to that difference in ingredient, you get different flavor development when it comes to that milk chocolate flavor. And what so many people in the United States love as Hershey milk chocolate, some Europeans that have never encountered it before associated with less pleasant associations, such as baby vomit. And really, it's depending on the context. There are some compounds that are formed in Hershey chocolate that, depending on your context and your previous experiences, may trigger, oh my God, Hershey milk chocolate, I love it, or oh my God, this tastes and smells like baby vomit. Same with Parmesan cheese. If you ever smell Parmesan cheese, it's the same thing.
Yeah, there's a specific chemicals that are produced during the slightly fermented milk process, and so there's what is it, Helena? It's lactic acid?
No, it's butyric acid.
I'm sorry, butyric acid. So there's a slight acidity to the chocolate in a very special acid that is produced by the fermented milk that gives this specific flavor. But again, it's not about what is the best chocolate for anybody in the world. It's what is the best chocolate for me and for you. So everybody is individual. And some days I eat Hershey chocolate, and some days I eat Belgian chocolate. And it depends on my mood and what I need.
I'm going to wrap this up by saying we're getting a lot of comments of people saying thank you for such an entertaining, informative, and well-done presentation. I think we all have learned an incredible amount about chocolate and have permission to go and buy 4 or 5 or maybe a dozen kinds of chocolate and try them all and see what we think, all those interesting flavor combinations and different percentages of chocolate. So thank you all so much for your time this afternoon, for joining us and sharing your expertise.
Thank you, everybody.